Well, there is a higher law than man. There's no doubt about it, even though some people don't believe that. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hieronimus, and our executive producer and research assistant, Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington. Before we introduce you to our guest, Preston Dennett, and his topic of underwater UFOs and the healing power of UFOs, I have a dedication here to make. Tonight's show is dedicated to my dear older sister Dolly, who passed away peacefully in her sleep at home yesterday. Dolly has been suffering from chronic pain for years, and this release is a blessing. But I will still miss her greatly. She was named for our mother Florence, but we all called Dolly her Dolly because she was genuinely sweet and lovable to everybody. Such a generous heart she had. I have about a dozen stepsisters and brothers and one half-sister, but Dolly was the only sibling who shared the same mother and father as me. And when we were younger, I'll never forget how often she would pull my mother off me and then start taking the beating that was meant for me. Always she stood up for the underdog for the rest of her life. I also want to give grace and thanks to my half-sister Barbara Shoemaker for all her help to Dolly in these past few days, and a huge thank you for my dearly beloved Dr. Queen Zahara for handling all the initial details yesterday for me. Zahara truly acted the role of shepherd at the crossroads for Dolly's last 24 hours and performed a great service. I love you more and more every day, my queen. Now, we posted a photo on Facebook of Dolly holding a figurine of Frodo with Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, a passion we shared in common. She named her late cat Frodo, and Zoe says she saw them dancing already, reunited together in the spirit world. That is, she saw the cat and her and Dolly dancing together. I also saw Dolly reunited with her father and our grandparents, and in the loving hands of her Savior, Jesus Christ. Rest in peace, dear Dolly. I'm glad you have been set free. Now on to Preston Dennett and UFOs. Preston Dennett began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that his family, friends, and coworkers were having dramatic, unexplained encounters. Since then, he has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. He is a field investigator for the MUFON UFO Network and the author of 23 books and 100 articles, and they have been translated into numerous foreign languages, and that's really helpful. He has also taught classes on paranormal subjects, lectures across the country, and this will be Preston's 12th appearance on 21st Century Radio. Obviously, we think very highly of his research. We will review his latest book called Healing Power of UFOs, 300 true accounts of people healed by extraterrestrials. In Hour 2, we'll focus on his 2018 titled Undersea UFO Base, an in-depth investigation of USOs in the Santa Catalina Channel. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Preston Dennett.
Hey, thank you. It's an honor. Thank you very much.
Well, it's an honor to have you. You really have been doing some great stuff, Preston.
I've been working hard.
I know you're one of the hardest UFO workers I've ever known. And the best thing about you is you keep checking what people are saying rather than just accepting what they're saying. And that's enormously important in this particular subject. Now, so how did you get involved with UFO research, Preston?
Involuntarily. It was not my choice, something I certainly wasn't looking for. And what happened, I was very skeptical of this subject and heard a report on the news about a sighting over Alaska back in 1986. November, I remember it vividly. We were all there, my whole family. I had 5 brothers and sisters, pretty big family, and we all just kind of went, and didn't think much of it, except I thought, my gosh, this pilot is putting his reputation on the line. And I remembered that my brother, years earlier, had said he'd seen a UFO, and we all just kind of laughed at him. and I asked him about it, and he described this really amazing encounter. He was with two friends who I knew, and they chased this metallic ship down the Reseda Boulevard, actually, here in Southern California. And thought, wow, and can I talk to, Phil and Greg, the other guys who were there? And he's like, sure. And it was pretty compelling what they were telling me. So I started asking everyone I knew. Found people at work who had seen UFOs. I had a friend who had missing time. Someone at work had missing time.
Boy, what a big surprise this was, wasn't it? For all of you,
yeah,
all of a sudden you bump into this?
Not good news. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I bought all the UFO books. I was going to disprove this subject, and found out actually there was a lot of evidence out there. It had been studied for decades. Still wasn't being taken seriously. It was, fraught with controversy, all kinds of things that really I wasn't expecting, but did find a lot of people within my circle of family and friends and coworkers who had really dramatic encounters.
I bet you I laughed at UFOs harder than you did in the old days.
I just didn't believe it. I remember seeing
didn't either.
In Search Of. That was like one of the only TV programs
I remember that one,
featured it. And I'm like, yeah, right. This whole family claimed they saw a UFO. And I'm like, well, they were, obviously misperceiving. I found, I had made a bunch of false assumptions about this subject, which I think skeptics in general do. They don't realize how much evidence there is out there. They don't realize that how many people are seeing these kinds of things.
Right, yeah. Well, ever since New York Times, it was just a couple of years ago, broke that story on giving their support to looking into UFOs. And now there's some very big articles all over the place. It seems that the government now is accepting the fact that they should let people know about them. And I just feel so poorly for all those other people that lost their jobs, got punished in one way or the other, ridiculed, etc. And now we're finding out that all of it was basically true.
Yeah, can you imagine? I mean, there are reports of people who've lost their lives over this subject. It's taken very, very seriously at high levels of government. They've known for a very long time it's a real phenomena, and still ridiculed witnesses. In my opinion, our military handled this pretty poorly. I do have sympathy for them because this is a difficult situation. And from a military standpoint, this is an unknown and a threat to national security for sure.
Yeah.
So there's still a cover-up. Yes, it's crumbling. This disclosure movement is moving forward, but it's still not open yet. Our work isn't done.
Yeah, still people are going to get fired for it every now and then if you open your mouth too much. Well, how did you get involved in researching UFO healings?
I interviewed this lady who had this dramatic sighting. She started describing this other experience she had where she had been diagnosed with a cyst in her fallopian tubes. It was causing her all kinds of problems. And mind you, she had had a lot of sightings. She'd been abducted for years and years, described a very rich history of UFO encounters within her own life. And was diagnosed with the cyst and had it diagnosed, and an operation was set, surgery. And the night before the surgery, she had a visitation in her room. She doesn't really remember what happened other than, quote, they came to visit her. And she goes to the doctor the next day, and they're like, well, they took the MRIs and x-rays prior to surgery. And they're like, well, this is strange. We can't find the cyst. And did you have surgery? Where did you go to have surgery? And she's like, well, I didn't. Knowing, probably what happened here. And this person who reads the x-ray is like, well, we know you did because there's fluid here, in your fallopian tubes, which is only present after having had surgery. And then pointed out a laser scar on her abdomen and accused her of having surgery, which she denied.
It's a little,
so
that's a little bit backwards here.
Right. So this is an excellent case. There's other cases just like this. Bill Hamilton caught a case, again, with before and after x-rays of a lady who had a cyst in her breast and had an experience. Literally, the day before the operation. This is a phenomenon that turns up over and over again in UFO healing cases. ETs will heal people immediately prior to them having their scheduled surgery. Mm-hmm. So that happened in this case for sure.
So they must be pretty smart cookies to be able to do such things. I really was excited when I read the case number 001, the young boy who was driving his tricycle when he had a problem. He fell down and broke his leg, or it was his arm.
Right. He believes it was his arm. It's a very early case, the first one actually that I could find.
Yeah, 1914. Wow, that's really going back there, brother.
Can you imagine? I mean, this phenomenon has been going on for at least 100 years.
Yeah.
Certainly since the 1950s, it kicks up. But that's the earliest case I could find. And this kid falls, breaks his arm. He thinks it's broken, and sees this little short figure with compelling eyes, and thinking it's a leprechaun or something. The figure says, "No, I'm a gnome," which is kind of interesting.
Yes, it is. Yeah, that was fascinating, really. So please go on. I got too excited there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long tradition, certainly, of these kinds of creatures throughout the world, whether it's fairies, gnomes, leprechauns, and things like this, which some researchers have linked to the UFO phenomena. Certainly there are a lot of parallels, and while this child didn't see a UFO per se, a craft, he did see this short figure.
2.5 feet tall, you said, something like that. 2.5 feet tall.
And who proceeds to heal him, which is really unusual. Didn't use any, instrumentation, just sort of, at least that wasn't reported. Mm-hmm. But I have to say that, of the 300 cases, a good 10% don't involve instruments. It's more of a hands-on healing done on the part of the ETs. So that does happen.
Yeah. Do you think we humans can do that sometime in the future, Preston?
Oh, yeah.
The hands-on healing.
Yeah, I put a chapter on this in the book because this is something the ETs are very interested in teaching people.
Yeah.
And it's something that, is probably the most common thing I see in terms of people who have had extensive contact and come away from their experience transformed in some way. Often it'll be like maybe channeling or dowsing or giving psychic readings. But usually it's some sort of Reiki or hands-on healing of some form, and often very effective. I mean, one lady I interviewed, she quit her job as a telephone operator and became a massage therapist and healer. And she got all these testimonials of people seeing light coming out of her hands and actually healing them. And as she's doing it, she gets this vision in her head of the gray ETs up in their ship. They're like fussing around with knobs and levers and stuff to assist her in her healing. It's very fascinating.
That is. It kind of reminds me of what we used to think about in 1968 and 69 of literally helping others out without looking for any pay, anything. You just help. You serve. I think that's a major part of, if you don't mind my saying, Jesus. Do you mind that?
Oh, not at all.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. But one of the great healers of all time, who can actually taught other people, of course, to heal, especially women. He was much more strong in relationship to women than our present any religion talks about. And that's one of the things that excited me so much to learn about that. Well, what types of break time on 21st Century Radio with our guest Preston Dennett. We're going to be talking about the healing power of UFOs. 300 true accounts of people healed by extraterrestrials, published by Blue Giant Books in 2019. And later, with the undersea UFO base. You want to hang around for that because that is extraordinary.
Hello, this is Alejandro Rojas, UFO journalist with OpenMinds.tv. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus. You can read more about us at OpenMinds.tv.
Welcome back with our guest Preston Dennett. We're talking about the healing power of UFOs, 300 true accounts of people healed by extraterrestrials. You think we like this book? Yes, we more than like this book. We love this book. Are you with us, Preston?
I'm here.
Okay. What types of illnesses and conditions have been healed?
Oh, it's astonishing. Of the 300 cases I document here, 70 involve injuries of all kinds. And by that I mean, cuts, broken bones, head injuries, back injuries, a huge variety of injuries. About 50 cases involving minor illnesses and infections, like the flu perhaps, or colds and things like that. 120 cases involving serious illnesses and 40 involving cancer. So, I put a list in the book. I'll just do a quick rundown of some of the cases because, the variety is amazing.
It is. It is amazing.
AIDS, there's 2 cases involving AIDS. Arthritis, 20 cases. Asthma, Chagas disease, there's 1 case involving that. Crohn's disease, colitis, diabetes, diphtheria, a couple of cases involving eczema, epilepsy, bunch of cases involving eye improvements and dental improvements, kidney problems, liver problems, hypoglycemia, case involving multiple sclerosis, one involving muscular dystrophy. It goes on. Rheumatism, strokes. There's a very long list of conditions that ET's healed. And what I've discovered is if you examine onboard UFO accounts, there's a very strong medical theme that runs through them. The single most common thing people report, and this is borne out by several studies and certainly my own research, is that people are physically examined. And I believe, at this point, that the extraterrestrials know more about the human body than we do.
Yeah, I bet you they do.
Yeah, and it's evidenced by the fact that they're curing what we would call chronic diseases.
Well, now, how are these healings done, and where do they take place? Do these people go to an office or something?
Well, the healings are done in a number of different ways. I would say most common, it's probably about 50% of the cases involve light of some form. Perhaps it's coming from the UFO itself and shining down on them, or perhaps they're taken on board and the ETs are holding instruments that emit laser-like lights. That's very common. There are some cases involving medicine. That's not common, but a good 10-20% involve pills or lotions of some form, or a drink that they're given. Sometimes there's no known method. It's just being in the mere presence of a UFO seems to affect a cure. So it's hard to say as far as where these cases are taking place.
Yeah.
We do know that about half of the cases, people are taken on board a craft and they're given some sort of a operation or surgery or procedure. And about 20% of the cases, people are outside, perhaps driving their car or walking. Another 20% people are in their homes, usually their bedrooms. And here, this really shocked me, and I wasn't expecting it. 10% of the cases, at least, take place in hospitals, in hospital rooms.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful because there's so many mistakes made in hospitals. I'm glad they're hanging around there. I talked about my sister. She was treated terribly, terrible. Northwest Hospital has something is really wrong there. Excuse me, but boy.
Yeah, no, our medical health system's got some real problems, and this comes up. There's one case where a gentleman was visited by ETs who were working on his knee. He's like, "Oh, you're hurting me." And they said, "Well, we're trying to heal your knee." This was a gray who was manipulating his knee, and the other gray, there was 2 of them, was in the bathroom, lifted up some pain medication, and walked back into the main room, the living room, and asked the witness about its use and what was it for. And often, they will express sort of not a disdain, but a sort of a disappointment in how primitive our own medical research is. Mm-hmm. That does come up.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, what kinds of people are being healed?
All kinds of people. This was the really kind of interesting to me at first, and it also bothered me because I couldn't find any patterns. The first thing I looked for, of the 300 cases is, it's evenly divided between men and women, certainly all across the planet. Most of the cases are from the United States, but that's certainly because I'm centered here in California. But absolutely worldwide. The United States produces more than anyone else. Canada, I think, is next, then England and Russia and all the major so-called superpowers, which makes total sense. I couldn't find any basis on, race or religion or age even. There's cases involving very young children, cases involving very elderly people as well. So what I did finally find is one pattern which kept turning up. And about the 50th time I saw it, I'm like, well, I think this is a thing. And that is profession, a person's job. And it's a loose pattern, but what I found is that people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity have a much more higher likelihood of being healed. Now, if you have a history of UFO encounters, that certainly does increase your chances, because about half the cases involve people who have a history of onboard experiences. But a good third don't. And this weird pattern kept turning up, involving people who are social workers, perhaps, inventors, doctors, turns up a lot, teachers, entertainers even, human rights activists, this sort of thing. And it turns up enough where I'm like, wow, here it is again.
Yeah, yes. And that's super important. Service to others is the key to, in my opinion, absolutely most everything. That's how, when people get involved with serving others without thinking about themselves, then that kind of love is this kind of love Jesus had, if you don't mind my saying.
Right. There are at least 3 cases that support that. I find it interesting, a quote from Betty Andreasson, very famous abductee, where the Greys told her flat out that love is the answer for humankind.
Yeah.
I totally agree. It's so simple and would solve so many of our problems.
You're darn right. We understood that back in 1968 and 69, and that's what Woodstock was all about, but most people had no idea what was going on. Now, how many cases are there? Are there more healings or injuries?
The 300 cases I've documented in this book are only the tip of the iceberg. I'm still finding new cases every time I speak about this. And here's the thing. I think most UFO researchers will agree with this. Most people don't report their sightings, their experience. Mm-hmm. Something I always ask people when I interview them, like, have you told anyone else? Who did you report? Did you call to the police, a UFO reporting center? Most people don't. I'm going to say 1 in 10 do it, and that's being very generous. I'm probably closer to 1 in 100, so I'm guessing there's way more than what we're seeing here. And here's another problem. There's a wide variety of alternative healings coming from different sources. If you look into the literature on angels, it's very compelling. And there are a lot of healing cases and some really remarkable similarities to, ET encounters. Beings of light coming and healing people.
Light seems to be an extremely important aspect, whether or not I've always been curious about their difference between their green lights and their blue lights and their orange lights, as to whether or not they have. Do you know if they have any speciality with each one of those different colors?
Have not been able to determine that, because what I'm seeing in these cases is a wide variety of colors.
You sure are.
The Peruvian's customs official goes out onto his veranda and sees a UFO up there, and this purple beam of light comes down and strikes him. And he is healed of nearsightedness as a result of being struck by this beam of light, and his chronic rheumatism cleared up right afterwards.
Wonderful. How wonderful. Well, is there any evidence or proof to support UFO healings?
Oh, yeah. Some cases rely on, eyewitness testimony for the most part. Other cases are extremely well documented. There was a case from Brazil, Ventura Maceres, who was struck by a beam of light from a UFO, and there was a lot of physical evidence to support his story because he suffered from what amounted to a light case of radiation sickness. He had vomiting, nausea. There was burn marks on the tops of the eucalyptus trees. A bunch of fish in a nearby stream died. All these, ancillary pieces of evidence to support it. And then this gentleman started to grow a third set of teeth. Mind you, he's 73.
Oh, isn't that wonderful? Big surprise there.
Yeah, and he was examined by 40 or 50 different officials in different capacities, government officials, doctors certainly, UFO investigators, law enforcement. A lot of people showed interest in his case, because it was so remarkable. Another gentleman, Jim Schaefer from Winnipeg, Canada, I interviewed him myself. He sent me his medical records showing a cancerous tumor on his neck. He had an experience with this glowing orb, which went into his body. He went to sleep, woke up the next day, and this tumor on his neck, a visible tumor, was gone. Was scheduled for surgery in about 3 days from then, I believe it was. Went to the surgeon, and he had been very forthcoming with his doctor. He had a medical history of UFO visitations and told his doctor what was happening because he'd come back with cuts and bruises and things like this. And the doctor was like, I don't know what to say, but I can't explain this or that. And then he goes and says, well, the tumor was taken away. And they were astounded. They still did the operation to remove necrotic tissue, but could not find any cancer and marked his case as a miraculous healing. Didn't put in, E.T. healed him, but could not account for it, and definitely found him believable, and certainly I did.
Mm-hmm. Well, what kind of ETs are performing these healings?
Another very interesting thing about this whole phenomena is I was kind of expecting to hear that these healings were mostly done by human looking, so-called Nordic. It's not a term I really like because there are lots of human looking ETs who are not Nordic looking in that sense. One gentleman, he said it was the ET he saw really looked more Middle Eastern than anything else. And another gentleman said, they look like, maybe South American, Peruvian, Mexican. So you get all different types of human looking ETs. And that's definitely a category for sure. But half of the healings, now this is in cases where people see a humanoid, half are some version of the grays. After that, it would be human looking. There are a number of cases involving praying mantis ETs.
Oh, that is special.
And those are the main three types I see, beyond UFO healing cases. And there's a huge category of just sort of a catch-all category of short humanoids, tall humanoids. As an example, one lady I interviewed, a lady from Nebraska, a housewife suffering from hypoglycemia, found herself in this chamber, like an underground base is what she thought it might be, and there was this 9-foot-tall humanoid who has healed her. And she says it was not human. It was 8 or 9 feet tall, had a very broad face, a huge chin, huge forehead, very strange eyes, and it wasn't hair on his head. It was something else, she said, like straw, very thick and orange and stuck straight up.
That's adorable. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and this being, put these silver bell-like instruments on her body, which pulsed energy into her body. At the time, she was very sick. She was passing out every day, had a real blood sugar problem that the doctors could not diagnose. And passed out at this point. She was very frightened and woke up back in her home, and she stopped passing out from that day on. She was fine. So, a wide variety of beings are doing these healings, but it's mostly grays. And for that matter, like here at this case, it's so bizarre. This guy's driving to the hospital because he's in kidney pain from a kidney stone. It's very painful. He's rushing to the hospital, and a UFO shows up and starts circling the car, and his pain gets less and less and less and less, and the UFO darts away. The pain is gone. They go to the hospital anyway and cannot find any kidney stone, which had been previously diagnosed. So no being seen there. I don't know who's doing it.
Yeah. Well, we need another break here on 21st Century Radio with our guest, Preston Dennett, The Healing Power of UFOs, 300 True Accounts. We're not going to get any 300, but let me tell you, this is an extraordinary book. Anybody interested in UFOs needs this book. We're going to try to put this book in the hands of many young people.
Hi, I'm Michael A. Cremo. I'm author of the book Forbidden Archaeology, and I'm very happy to be on 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus. It is a fascinating show, intellectually groundbreaking, presenting alternative points of view on all areas of science and popular culture.
Okay. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. We're still hearing UFOs in the background. And our guest, of course, is Preston Dennett. Now, Preston, what do these types of cases say about ET? Are they benevolent or are they hostile?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a great question because what we see, in terms of the media with the UFO phenomena is it's very fear-based.
Yeah.
And these types of cases are not presented very often.
That's right.
Certainly, I've surveyed the major researchers, and pretty much all of them do have these kinds of cases. Bud Hopkins, certainly, David Jacobs, Edith Fiore, Tim Beckley, Brad Steiger. I mean, I could go down the list. Barbara Lamb, Yvonne Smith, they're all reporting these types of cases, but we don't hear a lot about them. I think one of the reasons is that people who have traumatic experiences seek therapy and help and try to sort of socialize their conflict and get some help. Whereas people who are, say, healed don't have that need and may be even more reluctant to report their case due to its sensational nature. But for sure, this phenomena of UFO healings shows a much brighter side to the ETs, a much more benevolent and positive side. And if you look at sort of the umbrella of human behavior and compare that to, how the ETs are behaving, I think you'll find it's very similar in a lot of ways, except it's skewed towards the positive. Because what we don't see in terms of onboard UFO experiences is what I would call sadism or torture or mass murderers or, things like this. The worst we really get is some people do report pain, certainly during some of these procedures. It's not super common, and often the pain is relieved once the patient starts feeling it. But sometimes people feel like they're being treated very much like a lab rat, a lab animal. There's little regard for their feelings. The ETs are not very communicative in some cases. That's a minority. I'm going to say a good half, at least, of the people who have had a healing feel very benevolent towards the ETs, and there are a good number of cases that just smack of altruism. There's another percentage of cases that don't, where people feel like, they're just using me to produce hybrid babies, this sort of thing. There was one gentleman who didn't remember his experiences consciously. He went under hypnosis and recovered some fairly horrendous memories of operations at the hands of ETs. It was not a pleasant experience for him, even though they did cure him twice, once of a mole on his face and another of kidney stones. So it's hard to really say, exactly the intentions of the ETs in terms of the healing cases, but it does, to me, it sounds like, some of these cases, are absolutely altruistic.
I've always been a bit concerned, though, about the UFO itself. Some have seemed to be toxic when people get too close to them. Now, that's not what the ETs want to happen. It's just that I know you listed one or two of the cases that I'm talking about in which they had cancer and it took a long time, and they eventually ended up dying, unfortunately, and the government ignored their problem altogether because they didn't believe that they actually were aboard an ET, or excuse me, a UFO, or was related to that. Do you remember those cases?
Oh yeah, there are a good, several hundred cases involving what you would term injuries. That's you got to be careful when you use that term, because some people just report like eye irritation. Is that an injury? Well, in some cases, people have reported more serious problems. It's not uncommon to have a migraine headache after a close-up UFO sighting. I did not know that was a thing, but that certainly does turn up. There are a good number of cases where people have gotten too close to a UFO or were struck by a beam of light from one and suffered what would be diagnosed today certainly as radiation sickness. And some have died from this. Mm-hmm. So there is a dark side to this phenomena. Probably not a good idea to just run up to any UFO you see. But in general, I don't think that this is something to be afraid of. I don't think they're trying to hurt people. That's not the agenda at all.
Right. I agree. But I think the military is going to look at it a bit differently. And a lot of politicians are going to look at it differently. And that's why I think your book is so important. Because my being able to put this book in the hands of other people that I've argued with about this for some years is going to make me very happy. And I think it will make them happy too. Because, all of us want to think more positively. What do these cases tell us about our own medical technology? We touched actually on this a little earlier.
Yeah, well, certainly we're seeing some remarkable parallels. We do use light a lot more now to cure people. We're speeding up the healing of flesh wounds using electrical impulses. We use laser beams to cure people of detached retina. There are cases just like that in the ET literature. Betty Hill, she described a laparoscopy before, this was in wide use. Right. So we know that they're using basically the same methods we use. And these cases should show us that such a thing as chronic is a misnomer or incurable. It's just not true. There are a lady from Canada who had terminal cancer and was expected to die, ended up having an onboard experience and a rather prolonged and painful operation at the hands of ETs, who told her, don't take any more medicine after we're done. Just drink water. You're going to be fine. And she was. She got very sick afterwards. Doctors thought she was going to die. Her whole family was called. But she rallied and recovered completely from terminal cancer. There's a lot of cases like that. So I think this provides sort of an avenue or certainly hope to look into, so-called terminal cases and realize they're not.
Why would an ET travel light years to cure someone of a common cold?
Yeah, there's so many cases like this too.
I know.
Chuck Doyle from Kentucky, 13 years old, has a terrible head cold, is out in his backyard and struck by a beam of light from a UFO, which cures him. I mean, is this an accident? I don't know. It's really hard to say. But there are so many cases like this. Jim Sparks, a well-known abductee, was cured.
Oh, Jim, yeah.
Yeah, he was cured of the flu. Later had an experience where he was taken on board a craft, and the ETs handed him this box, this clear little box filled with black goo. It stunk real bad, and they said, this is our gift to you. He's like, well, what's this? And we're like, well, we removed this from your lungs.
Oh, my gosh.
Right? He was a heavy smoker at the time. Got another case just like this, same exact thing. The witness says the same exact thing, except describes a slightly different container was really the only difference. And later the ETs came back because this guy, the same guy, had started smoking marijuana. And the ETs were furious and said, you have to stop smoking marijuana. This is not the life we had planned for you.
Yeah, they do take part in your life, that's for sure. Do ETs help other people in other ways?
Yes, and it's really remarkable. And I keep hearing more cases like this. I just found a case where people saw a UFO hovering over the 3 Mile Island plant, and it was immediately the next day that the officials announced that the damage was not nearly as bad as they thought it was, because they were expecting a full meltdown. And these witnesses are like, could it be possible that ETs have healed or helped us? Got a lot of cases like this in the book. Here's a great one. This guy's driving along a highway. I believe this is in Colorado at night. And suddenly this UFO appears in front of him on the road and shines down a beam of light right on the road in front of him, illuminating a mattress on the road, which he would have hit. He had time to swerve around it. Why would, what's going on here? RD6 Killer Clark provides cases like this. There's like another case in Nevada. 3 teenagers had gotten their car stuck in the sand in the desert. They were pretty far from civilization. They were going to have to spend the night, and a UFO shows up and lifts their car out of the sand and puts it on the road. That may sound unusual, but I have to tell you, I've written a number of books on various states, UFOs over California, New York, Nevada, Arizona. They all have what are called car lift cases, where cars are levitated. This is something UFOs do, and they help these kids out in that case. A number of cases involving people saved from car accidents. One lady was saved from assault. A couple of people saved of drowning. A case in South America from RD6 Killer Clark. This UFO hovers over an entire village and protects it from hurricane winds and torrential rains, which were threatening to wash away the entire village. So yeah, it does happen.
One last question here this hour. How do healings compare to miraculous healings, UFO healings? How do they compare to the miraculous healings?
Yeah, well, as we mentioned earlier, there are other miraculous healings, and there's this very strong parallels with angels, certainly.
Yeah.
Another thing I looked into was near-death experiences, which is, connected to the other side, and out-of-body experiences, astral travel. 20 or 30 cases of people have been healed of chronic illnesses and injuries through that, a near-death experience. Another thing, and this was shocking to me, literally, no pun intended, was lightning. I knew of a case, Mary Clamser, who was cured of multiple sclerosis after being struck by lightning, looked into it. Turns out there's a long history of this, about 100 cases in the medical literature, like the Lancet Journal. Really reputable medical journals have reported a wide variety of healings of paralysis, blindness, deafness, cancer, and really a long variety of diseases stretching back over 100 years. Lightning.
Well, we're just about out of time for this hour, and when we return, Preston, you're going to talk to us about underwater UFOs. I don't know if you knew this, but underwater UFOs are my favorite UFOs, except for cigar-shaped craft. They're also, I've actually put in my murals at Johns Hopkins University various types of craft, especially those of the cigar shape. We'll be back with our guest in just a few minutes. Well, welcome back to us on 21st Century Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hieronimus. Our executive producer, research assistants, Laura Cordner, and our engineer is Anita Brockington. Now, we talked about the healing power of UFOs, but now we're going to one of my most favorite things in the whole wide world, undersea UFO bases, an in-depth investigation of USOs in the Santa Catalina Channel and published by Blue Giant Books. And we were just with our friends Robert Skinner and his wife Marlo Skinner. They were our guides through Southern California, and boy, did we have a wonderful time going to Venice Beach and other places like that. And there you have a good story on Venice Beach in here, and a very large possible UFO. Is that correct there?
That is correct. Yeah, that whole coastline is just saturated with USOs, unidentified submersible objects.
Well, look, how did you get involved in researching underwater UFO activity?
Pretty much right when I started doing UFO research. I lived up in Topanga Canyon area, which is right along the coast here in Southern California. Started to get reports of USOs. Now, I call them USOs because you can't really call them UFOs if they're not flying. They're submerged. They're submersible. They're swimming. So that's the term that we use. But essentially, they are the same thing, I think. And I found a bunch of cases. I was interviewing like one lady. Her name was Linda Young, I believe it was, or perhaps Susan. I always get her two names mixed up, which is her middle name, I'm not sure. But at any rate, she's driving along with her friend. Her friend is actually driving along the Pacific Coast Highway. This is in Santa Monica area. And out there on the water, she sees this really bright light. Kind of didn't look like a ship. It looked really strange. It was just this huge bright light. And she turns to her friend and points out the light and says, "What's that?" And as soon as her friend looks, literally that exact moment, this thing takes off straight up and disappears faster than any plane or even a rocket. It was very unusual. I talked to another gentleman who lives in Malibu, right on the beach, and saw this really bright prism-like object flashing these multi-colors. And he thought for sure a boat was on fire out there. He called the Coast Guard, and they denied it. They said, "No, there's nothing out there." And he says, "Well, I'm seeing something." They said, "Well, maybe it's squid fishermen." And he says, "No, I've seen those." And he saw this thing twice. So those were a couple of early cases which got me interested in this. I didn't really look into it until I published UFOs over California. And by then I had amassed, a good 20 or 30 ocean-going UFO cases off the coast here and devoted a whole chapter to it and thought, this would be a good way to publicize the book. And started looking into it and found a bunch more cases and wrote an article for Fate magazine called "Is There an Undersea UFO Base Off the California Coast?" Because I had talked to this abductee who was not taken into a UFO. He was taken somewhere else. I was collecting a lot of these objects coming in and out of the water, cases of that. And it just exploded from there. The History Channel called me up to do deep sea UFOs, 1 and 2, because it was so successful. It broke rating records for them. And that brought in a flood of cases. Started lecturing about this. That brought in more cases. So these cases literally just started flooding in. I didn't ask for it. It just sort of happened.
It's your karma, for some reason or other. Would you accept that this is your karma?
Yeah, I'll accept that. I did find that this was a well-known hotspot.
Yep.
Anne Druffel, from the 1940s.
Oh, God bless her, Anne Druffel. I'm so glad you quoted her often in your book. She's a real lovely lady. Yeah,
and a truly pioneering researcher.
Yeah, really.
One of the few woman researchers back, in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And very influential. She uncovered a bunch of cases, as did pretty much all the major Southern California researchers, like, Robert Stanley, Bill Hamilton, Barbara Lamb, Yvonne Smith. They all have cases. Robert Stanley talks about how families would go down to the beach in the 70s and watch these objects coming in and out of the water. I verified that with other witnesses. This phenomena here off the coast is pretty well known among locals, that this stretch of water between Santa Catalina Island and the mainland, stretching from about Santa Barbara all the way south to certainly through Malibu and Santa Monica and Rancho Palos Verdes, all the way even farther, Long Beach and San Clemente, I guess, would be the southern end. It's mile for mile really the top producer, or certainly one of them, on our planet of undersea UFOs.
Well, UFOs and USOs are there any different from one another?
I don't think so. But what they do have is an ability to go into the water without making a splash. I mean, here's...
I've always been fascinated. How do they do that? Does the water open up to them as they approach it?
Yeah, I think they must have a force field. Get this case. Here's a nice early case, 1954. The Japanese steamship, the Aliki, is off of Long Beach when, I think it was the Coast Guard intercepted this message. They see this fireball, what they thought was a fireball, come zooming down, and it crashes into the sea, travels along underwater, and comes out of the water and takes off, keeps moving. Obviously not a fireball, right?
Right.
But, I mean, this thing is able to do something that we can't do, certainly. And there are a lot of cases like this where I would say it's most common for people to see something going into the water. Mm-hmm. Second most common to see it coming out. And there's a good number of cases where people see this stuff, under their boat.
Oh, boy, your stories there are just fantastic. Man, the lights, like the green lights, is that what you're going to touch on there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's some really dramatic cases. I mean, one guy on the northern end of all of this, a senior electronics engineer, has this fully equipped boat, and it's at night. It's pretty foggy, and he sees this green light ahead of him. And he's thinking, well, what's that? This doesn't even look like a boat. Stops his, boat, because that's what you're supposed to do if you're in danger of a collision. And this thing not only approaches, pretty much makes a beeline for his boat. And this is a pattern of behavior, certainly, that turns up again and again in a number of cases where these things target boaters. This thing comes right under his boat, and he says it was, his depth sounded right. I think it was 50 or 100 feet before it broke, and it was much bigger than his boat. It was this huge green oval or round object or light, and his electronics went complete haywire. His compasses started spinning. His radio was malfunctioning. Entire electrical system was completely haywire. He's scared to death when finally this thing just moves on. And what was that? I mean, not a submarine.
Yeah.
Another guy says he's had his boat moored off Catalina Island or was traveling along the coastline there, and it lit up in this square pattern like a indoor swimming pool or something. Just very bright. Mm-hmm. Another case of a boater being targeted.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad I didn't take any boats out there. That green light thing is just overwhelming as far as I'm concerned, because I've seen too many bad movies that did something like that. To me, if you're on a little boat like that with these kind of things underwater and you're with your family or something, that would be just devastating. It really would. Sorry to get into that part of it, though. So you noted that is it the most USO activity in this particular area of where the undersea UFO base might be?
Yes, certainly. I've got reports from all over the world. Once people found out I was doing this research, a lot of people contacted me. Got some really wonderful cases. Gosh, one I just have to tell you because it's so amazing.
Well, tell us.
Occurred in 1971 off the East Coast. Ray Sachs was an electrician's mate on the USS Clamagore. And mind you, this is a Navy submarine that carried nuclear missiles. It was confidential at the time. Now we know. And I was able to verify his medical records. Very sincere gentleman who's elderly now and wanted to get his story out because it's incredible. They're booking along at 12 knots. They're on the surface of the ocean, heading north up the coast, the east coast of the United States at night. And he's on watch with another petty officer. The commander is up there, and so is the second in command. And they're not too far off the coast when suddenly this USO comes approaching from the stern at about 100 knots, approaching fast.
Yeah.
This is 100 knots is 50, 60, 70 miles an hour. This thing was coming in very fast, much faster than we have the ability to do. And it was big. It was this white circle of light, 20, 30 feet across, and came right alongside the Clamagore there, the submarine, maybe, 50 feet off, way, way, way too close for a, ocean-going vehicle, and paced this submarine for the next 15 minutes. And one by one, the higher-ranking officers came up on deck because they wanted to see it, and took a look at this thing and had no idea what it was. It was pretty shallow there. It wasn't that deep. It made no sound and kept pace with them perfectly. And suddenly, at some point, 15 minutes later, darted off at about 50 knots maybe in another direction. Meanwhile, Ray Sachs and the other lookout, they're just jibber-jabbering away, talking about it, wondering what it could be. This thing did not appear on sonar. Certainly, the captain asked. That was the first thing he asked Ray. Like, what did the sonar guys say? They couldn't see it. And this thing is gone, and the second in command turns to the captain and says, "Captain, how do you want me to record this in the log?" This is according to Ray Sachs. And the captain, the commander, says to the second in command, officers who report this sort of incident do not move up in rank.
Gets right to the point.
Right?
That's right. That's the way it goes.
So it wasn't recorded. I have to believe, the commander did tell his superiors, because that's why he's there. I mean, he's there to look out for strange craft of any kind, strange foreign craft, extraterrestrial or otherwise. So I have to believe that, yes, it was recorded on some level, but certainly not any written record of it, which concerns me. How often is this going on?
Yeah. How long has it been going on? You have any idea how long this USO activity has been going on?
Well, certainly there are historical accounts. I mean, Christopher Columbus.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, which is some time ago. I mean, he reported a fairly dramatic, bright object, coming up out of the water, I believe it was. So there are some historical accounts. They're fairly rare. However, they certainly do exist. Looking into this area here, I found cases stretching back to the 1920s, a couple, 1930s. Didn't get really active until about 1947. There was this very interesting incident off the San Francisco Bay area where ships were trying to navigate and kept encountering this sort of phantom reef or this moving mountain, this undersea mass that was appearing on their depth sounders and sonars or so on. And finally, it was causing such problems that they called up the Navy. The Navy sent a survey ship, the Maury, to check it out. And the Navy ship found this thing and tracked it down the coast, did not know what it was, all the way to California, Southern California, actually. And it moved out to sea a good 100, 200 miles. They caught it again and were giving readings on it when suddenly it moved away real quickly. And that's the last they saw it. It's a great case, very early. And following that, there are high-quality cases at least once a year in this area.
Well, we need to take a break here. So you get a lot of your best cases together and let us have them, because this is thrilling. This is so exciting to me, mainly because I know that since you did this work, it's credible. Others, I don't know, and that's really important to me. And that's the point. We'll be back with our guest, Preston Dennett. We are talking about the undersea UFO base. We're going to get into that in a few more minutes. An in-depth investigation of USOs in the Santa Catalina Channel. Blue Giant Books, 2018. Both books are available on Amazon.
Hello, this is Ellie Flippen, niece of the late psychic, visionary, artist, and extraordinary individual Ingo Swann. You can learn more about his archives, his paintings, and his books at ingoswann.com. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Friend Meryl Fankhauser here. This is the Mother Ship. And actually all night, the rest of the night, the music we're going to listen to is all Meryl Fankhauser. As a matter of fact, you did some... Are you with us, Preston?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay. And I want to thank you. I just remembered the page 177. You carried the story that we worked with Meryl. And tell us a little bit about Meryl Fankhauser and his work.
Yeah, I ended up contacting him because it turns out he's part of this story.
Yeah.
And there was a follow-up that's actually not in the book. He contacted me again, which I can't wait to tell you, because how he became involved in stories, I heard that he had heard about these sightings, and I wanted to verify that. He knew about this activity, and he did, in fact, said yes. When he was down in this area, at the time he was in his band, he heard about this activity of objects coming in out of the water and was given an offer to actually go see it, which he regretfully turned down, unfortunately. But that wasn't the end of the story. It turns out there was these weird radio signals coming off the coast here, which this gentleman was picking up in only a certain area. It was very strange. Turns out it's coming from this thing in the same area called the Malibu Anomaly. which we can get into, but looks like this weird artifact off the coast underwater. And is one of the sort of data points that made me think is, something going on here that might be involved with an undersea base. But Meryl Fankhauser got a hold of these weird radio tones and was able to use them in his music. And what's interesting about these tones is they sound very much like other tones that have been recorded from other UFO cases. Mm-hmm. And it's just very interesting. And, I've listened to how he used them, and it was fascinating and how well he was able to blend it in. And, some months later, after the book's published, he contacts me. He's like, I have to tell you this. I was in Las Vegas and came upon this gentleman who was a Chumash Native American, an elder. Now, this is significant because the Chumash lived in this area off the coast for many years, thousands of years. And this Chumash elder told Meryl Fankhauser that about this Malibu Anomaly, which is actually, just to get into it real briefly, is the structure with sort of these pillars and a flat top, and it looks like a tunnel located underwater off the coast, right in the center of all this activity. There's images of it on the internet that have gone viral. And what I find interesting is before this even broke, that story, I had charted all these underwater UFO cases, and this sort of anomaly is right in the center of where it's all going on. And this, going back to Meryl Fankhauser and this Chumash Native American elder, told him that they are aware of that anomaly, and in fact, they don't think it's natural. They think someone built it, and it wasn't them. It was there, according to their oral tradition, it was there long before them. And in fact, sea levels used to be much lower, and their ancestors used to fish off of this thing. Is what this guy told Meryl, which is fascinating to me because if you see the pictures of this thing, it's huge, and it does appear to have a tunnel. There are some pictures that show, it looks like a landslide. Certainly debunkers have said, no, it's nothing but it's called Sycamore Knoll. It's an earthquake fault. But, from an objective viewpoint, I don't see how you can choose images that don't show a tunnel as opposed to ones that do. Either way, I'm kind of on the fence about it, except for the fact that I've had a number of whistleblowers contact me, ask me, do I know about the tunnel? I'm like, no, tell me. I had heard rumors, of course. One gentleman who's pretty reputable, he's contacted me before, and his stuff is checked out, said, yeah, there's this tunnel that actually runs from Area 51 in Nevada all the way to Edwards Air Force Base up in the high desert in Southern California, all the way to the Santa Catalina Channel area.
That's
I had a number of people tell me this too. So this all started to build this sort of a puzzle piece of all these sort of data points pointing towards the existence of an undersea base here.
As a matter of fact, I'm going to hold up a book, your book, Undersea UFO Base, in our microphone here, because we've got some very advanced people out there that listen to this show for 30-some years and have advanced themselves into seeing things like this. Take a look at, there's the front cover that shows you what Preston is talking about. It's an interesting shot. Hey, by the way, what is your opinion on the work of Billy Meier?
Well, I think that it's probably a legitimate case, simply just because of the amount of witnesses that surround it. It doesn't rest only on his testimony. I believe probably a lot of his photographs are genuine, and his moving films. Generally, I do support the case. I don't think it's there are parts of it that bother me for sure.
Yeah, I think we all went through that. The models that turned up and things like that.
Yeah, there's landing trace cases. I mean, he turned in a metal fragment to Marcel Vogel, who studied it, and it had all kinds of unusual properties. There are some 300 witnesses surrounding it, several books written from other people who have seen stuff happen. He's got a couple of healing cases, by the way. I think it's a legit case. There's so much smoke around it. There's got to be a fire there.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning our dear friend, Dr. Marcel Vogel. We were very close for a long period of time. And is he still alive? I don't think he is.
I don't know. I don't think so, though. But he did some amazing work.
Yes, he did. Very kind. Another one of those people that serve, give. He helped so many people back there in the late 60s, early 70s when he used to visit us at the time. So it was wonderful hearing his name again. Now, you were supposed to, and it's my fault. You were supposed to go start giving us some of the best cases. I'm so excited by these things, mainly because there's so much detail. You give so much detail in these areas. It's not like other people's stuff that I've read, which are kind of general. So
yeah,
give us
whenever possible. Yeah, I tracked these cases down. I talked to a lot of people myself. I talked to a submarine navigator, several Navy officers, police officers, all kinds of Navy people, really. So I did my homework on this. Let me tell you.
Yeah, you don't have to tell me that, brother.
I surveyed the literature far and wide. One of my favorite cases, probably in the entire book, is a classic case that occurred on January 15th, 1956. I was investigated by Idabel Epperson, Len Stringfield, and other pioneering researchers at that time. On that evening, multiple residents of Redondo Beach who were there on the beach saw this kind of circular, glowing orange disc-shaped object come down in a gliding pattern and land on the surface of the water about 75 yards offshore. And it was just sitting there. A bunch of people started to gather and watch this thing as it sunk beneath the waves. And they could still see it glowing when lifeguards showed up from, not only Redondo Beach, but adjacent Hermosa Beach. And they rowed a boat out there and got over on top of this thing and could see that it was much bigger than their boat. They came back to shore. By this time, there's policemen there. There's night watchmen. There's a huge crowd of people. The water's frothing and making this kind of weird foam, and the object blinks out and disappears. Most of the people go away, not everybody, because they waited till morning. The Navy was still investigating. They came out the next day and brought divers with Geiger counters, obviously taking this whole thing very seriously, right?
Right.
And went out there and couldn't find anything, found nothing, found no evidence. And it was sometime later, because this generated a huge publicity thing. It was in the papers, and people wanted an explanation. And the Coast Guard released a ludicrous debunking explanation that really angered UFO researchers and said that this thing was a light buoy, buoy with a light on it.
Oh.
And actually, had these officers hold it up and pose for the press. And they're holding this thing. It's about a foot wide, maybe 2. And it's ridiculous because, for one thing, this thing fell out of the sky, or came gliding, and actually. It was 20 feet across. And it was quite luminous for a long time, longer than some of these things can do. So, there's just numerous details that don't fit a light buoy.
Yeah.
So it's really unfortunate that, they felt that they had to do that. That's certainly a pattern that turns up in other cases, but that's one of my favorite cases.
Do you think that some of the reasons why they still don't want any of this known is because they believe that people are going to go crazy if they find out that there's other life in the universe?
I think that that's a factor, and I don't think it's true. I don't think people will go crazy. We've handled all kinds of things.
Yeah, I agree.
You may point to the War of the Worlds and say, well, people panicked. And I'll say, well, listen, War of the Worlds was basically a horror story designed to incite terror and was very effective in that regard. And that's not how it would go down. I think there's a number of reasons why this subject is being covered up. Primarily because that was the pattern of behavior they established early on while they were trying to figure out what's going on. I think from a military standpoint, we do have to regard this phenomenon as a threat because it's unknown and it's hovering over our nuclear bases, over our dams, over our Air Force bases. It's stopping vehicles on the road, and for that matter, it's abducting people. So from a military standpoint, yeah, I have sympathy for them. I do think that they have to tread lightly a little bit around the subject, and any disclosure is gonna open a can of worms. It really is.
It certainly will. Yeah. Hey, what kind of witnesses have seen these USOs?
You get a huge wide variety. Mostly it's the people living in this area. Certainly there are tourist cases, pilots. I've talked to a pilot who was flying over the Santa Monica Bay with a student, and this giant UFO appeared next to them in cigar-shaped, glowing red, and they were about to report it to the local airport tower, decided not to because they didn't want to look like fools. And it just makes me wonder how many cases are not reported.
Mm-hmm, sure.
But yeah, I mean, certainly there's a good portion of military officers who are seeing this stuff. One guy I talked to, Gary Wagner, was on the USS Long Beach, which is a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. He was on the far side of Catalina Island. And this is a pattern, again, that turns up with UFOs. They seem to be very attracted to anything nuclear. And he had an experience where these objects showed up. They were apparently on the water, some distance from them. They were huge. They were pulsating lights with sort of weird sort of triangle cut out of one section of them. Very peculiar. And they're just pulsating in intensity and brightness and size. And he tried to contact the bridge, but they're like, listen, we can't talk right now. We're way too busy. It put the whole ship into complete chaos. But a very interesting case for sure.
We're in a bit of chaos right now, so we're going to take a break here on 21st Century Radio. We're speaking with Preston Dennett, and we'll be back with Preston Dennett and more about USOs.
This is Dr. Jacques Vallée. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus, the reference in the study of the paranormal.
Meryl Fankhauser's Messages from the Dome. That's what we're listening to here. That has the alleged recording of a USO. Thanks to Meryl Fankhauser and the work of Billy Meyer, because that's the information we sent to him, the piece that we sent to him, that he worked it out. Preston, since there's so much military in the area, I think Point Mugu, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Naval Base, San Clemente Island, Seal Beach, Naval Weapons Station. How do you know people aren't seeing military test craft? Right.
Yeah, there is a lot of them. It's practically surrounded by military, which is fascinating to me because there's so much activity here that it couldn't possibly be all military. I've got 5 or 6, actually 10 reasons why I think it's not military, certainly most of the activity. The first being it's been going on for way too long. We have modern reports stretching back to the 20s, continuing all the way to the present day. It's just far too much of this going on. It's far too much activity for this all to be military. Also, these craft that are being seen, and it's a really wide variety. It's not just saucer-shaped craft. It's V-shaped, manta ray-shaped, spherical. It goes on, cigar-shaped. These craft are way too advanced to be military. About 10 to possibly as high as 20% of these craft are actually being chased by military jets themselves. So we wouldn't be doing that if it was our own. Secondly, a good portion of these witnesses are themselves military officers who are completely baffled as to what they're seeing and are convinced it's not ours. Ultimately, I think the dead giveaway is that these objects are behaving in ways that is completely contrary to how military personnel would behave or even are allowed to behave. And by that I mean they are chasing cars down the road, coming very low over people's homes, hovering in place, lighting up the interior of their entire homes, putting on what amounts to displays. Yeah, So there are a lot of reasons why I don't think it's military. There's a number of cases in this area which involve not 10 or 20 objects, which is not that unusual, but it's somewhat unusual. 30 or 40 objects.
Oh, boy.
50, 100, 200 objects. And that is very unusual. I remember the first case I got in this area, 1992, there was a wave of sightings on June 14th, and a couple who lived high on the ridge overlooking the ocean saw the whole thing happen. Mind you, I talked to 30-odd people all over the area who saw stuff independently and didn't know about each other. So an extremely well-verified event in that regard. And this couple saw about 10, 20 objects come up from behind a ridge down by the ocean. And I thought, wow, really? And I said, well, yeah, actually, it was more than that. I went up to their house. They showed me everything. And I talked to them. They've since become pretty good friends. And they said this started around 8 p.m. that evening and went on till 11 p.m. And there was multiple waves of objects coming up from behind a ridge to the point where they started to count them. After like the third or fourth time of seeing 10, 20 objects, the lady, the wife, started to count these objects. And after it was done, they went inside and closed the door and the windows. They didn't want to count anymore because they had counted 200 objects. It was very upsetting for them. Yeah. The husband turns to me. He's like, well, I don't know if it was 100 or 200. She was counting, but it could have been only 100. I bust out laughing because I'm like, 100? Are you out of your mind? That's way too much. I mean, what is going on here? And a bunch of people on that night saw multiple craft. I finally found another witness who was down by the ocean on that night in Venice Beach and saw an enormous stadium-sized craft come. He didn't see it rise up out of the water. He heard the water pouring off of it, which is very unusual in these cases. Usually, that doesn't happen. It does in 5 or 10 cases at least, and it did in that one. He said it sounded like Niagara Falls, and he looks over, and a bunch of people are screaming and watching this thing. It's huge. It's got tiny little craft around it, and those tiny craft he's estimating are probably 20, 30 feet, maybe 50, but they looked like little gnats next to this thing. And the whole fleet just books it up north, up the coast, northwest, up the coastline there very quickly. He says it was out of sight in 5 seconds the most. Amazing case. And my point is, I got another case off Catalina Island involving Boy Scouts. They saw 200 objects. Where are all these objects coming from? If there's not an undersea base down there, there's a parking lot or something going on down there.
Yeah, you note that these UFOs seem to be coming up from the water, not from coming down from the sky.
Yeah, I've interviewed enough people who said they've seen a UFO that I'm like, all right, tell me what you saw. And generally speaking, people spot something swooping down out of the sky. This area has a number of cases where the stuff is coming from below and sometimes right out of the water there. And people watch it come out of the water. There's a few cases. Oh, this is so interesting. A lady was down by the Chart House restaurant there right on Topanga Beach with her friends and saw this object out there underwater. And this thing darts. She's estimating 500 miles an hour underwater. Can you imagine?
No, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to go 30 miles an hour over water, let alone underwater. Back to the underwater base. What is the best evidence for the existence of a base or that base?
Right. What I've done is I've built a case, which I think is pretty compelling for the existence of the space, based almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. And by that I mean we've got a huge number of eyewitness testimonies in a very defined area over a very long period of time. So something is clearly going on here. That's the first real data point. I think the second data point is these mass sightings. There are such a large number of these objects coming from below. Where are they coming from? A third data point is the so-called Malibu Anomaly, which we touched on, and is this giant stone structure underwater there, right where all this activity is going on, and it looks artificial. It has not been proven, but it hasn't been debunked either, not completely. Then there are, of course, the whistleblower accounts. And this is not just people who say there's tunnels. There's a couple of whistleblower accounts of people who say, oh, yeah, there's a base there. I know about it. I didn't work at it directly, said one guy, but it's there. Another lady said she worked at it directly, and it's got military people in there who are working with gray ETs. Mm-hmm. And fifth data point, and this is sort of, all bets are off now, are the abductees, the experiencers I've spoken with. And one gentleman's testimony is really compelling. He's a doctor, a private pilot. I still know him. He's a very lucid individual, very well educated, and described how he had a missing time experience as a child on Catalina Island. He was actually on Avalon Bay at the time it occurred with his friend. And through the years, had a number of close-up sightings and other experiences that pointed towards him being an experiencer, and finally, had enough of it and went to see Yvonne Smith and had a regression during which he recalled this incident on Catalina Island. I believe this was back quite some time in the 60s. He recalled not being taken into a UFO. He recalled being taken to an underground base, undersea possibly. He saw a very large chamber with rock walls. He said it was very large, and the walls were rough rock. He was placed on a bench. He was not afraid. He said they didn't hurt him at all. His friend appeared to be the target of the abduction, and they saw praying mantis or insectoid type beings. He said it was wearing this sort of a white sort of poncho type cloak over its shoulders, and took his friend away into another area, another chamber, and that's basically all he recalled. It wasn't a scary experience, but he had the distinct impression that he was underground. Mm-hmm. So there you go. I talked to another lady who had an astral travel experience. This case is not in the book. And she's like, oh, darn it, I wish I had known about your research, because I had this experience where I went out of body into this base. And she said there were grays there, and there was all kinds of really high-tech metallic-looking equipment. And she became frightened when the ETs they looked at her, even though she was, quote, out of body, in her astral body. Mm-hmm. And this is something she does regularly. She's claims to have this ability. And so, there's a lot of these little data points that point towards why I think there's a base there.
You're so fortunate. You've lived in Southern California for a long time, haven't you?
Most of my life, yeah.
The people out there are really very special. There's such a thing as there are parts of our country that are in much higher state of consciousness than others. And with the experiences that I've had, the limited ones, especially I'm working with a lot of Volkswagen people, and they're all so enormously friendly and kind. Every one of them that I know believes this particular idea that we are one people on one planet, so why in the hell are we fighting with one another? They're just very advanced souls. And of course, there are a lot of esoteric traditions that say that was part of that part, that is, the West Coast, was part of a larger continent. And there are so many exciting things out there, but the people are just extraordinary.
Yeah, I love this area, and I do hope that we can all get along. I agree with you that times are turbulent now, but to me it's a good sign that we're waking up.
Yes.
And people are aware of, the corruption and greed and the damages it causes, and how easily it can be solved by just reaching out to each other in a loving way. It's completely all right to disagree on issues. I can clear a room pretty quickly bringing up UFOs. If you just give me a chance, I can tell you that, this is nothing to be afraid of. It's a subject I take very seriously. I think it can solve a number of problems we have globally right now, including the energy crisis, the economic crisis,
all that,
and the environmental crisis. And it's important.
And especially dealing with healthcare issues. Boy, what a difference that would make. We got time maybe for one more question here. Have you ever seen a UFO, USO?
I haven't seen a USO in the classic sense where it's, underwater for sure. Mm-hmm. And yes, have seen UFOs, and it always blows my mind because I never saw anything growing up. I lived in an area that's a pretty well-known hotspot, and a bunch of people that I knew had seen stuff, and I didn't until I started investigating the stuff directly. And I remember my first real encounter so well, and I think it's tied to the fact that I was investigating this so strongly, is because I was targeted, for sure, by a UFO. I was driving home from my sister-in-law's house after discussing the subject. She was, and my brother, they were helping me out. This was July 1992, and at night, and I see this, what I thought was a bird, come swooping down towards my car, and instantly realized it wasn't a bird. It was a ball of light about the size of a large golf ball, maybe. It's bigger than a golf ball a little bit, and glowing bright right in front of my windshield. 2 feet, 3 feet, swept back and forth 2 or 3 times, dipped down right below the hood of my car, went straight up through the canopy of trees and out into outer space. And I'm like, wow, what was that? That was the first one.
Where was that?
That was in Woodland Hills, not far from where I'm living now, actually. Woodland Hills, California.
And you're going to tell us about one more before we have to say goodbye?
Oh, yeah, sure. This one lady, gosh, I had interviewed her. She was actually the lady who had been healed of a cyst. She showed me a UFO. First of all, I was transcribing her testimony. I'm like, gosh, this is wild. I'm not sure if I believe it. When I had a very strong impulse to run into the roof of my condo, something I'd never done, and thought, what am I doing up here? When this UFO showed up and it says, hi, I'll call her Wendy. We're Wendy's ETs. It kind of gave me this message. I'm like, whoa. And it says, we're real. Watch this. And it darts around.
Well, we are out of time. I'm awfully sorry. Preston, thank you for joining us. No, we're going to invite you back in the future. And that's the show. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington, and I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus.